this rebranding as a prostitute, to me, this is a symbolic act of erasure and violence. It takes a woman who was the first evangelist, the first
She
one
was a
sent,
prophet, yeah.
and took her and reframed her, a church leader, as a cautionary tale of sin. Now, what does this do? It ensures that any woman aspiring to leadership in the church would have a tarnished archetype. You're not enough alone. You have to be redeemed. All of this serves to neutralize the threat that her leadership poses to a male power structure.
It's all about us, and it's time to bow down. Everybody, welcome back to another episode of Bow Down. Dennis, as always, so great to see you, and I'm so excited to dive into this discussion of Mary Magdalene.
Me too. It's great to get back to our Biblical Women series.
Yes.
Where we just we explore and we reflect on how things make us feel. So yeah, looking lovely today. Love the background. That's
Thank you.
as always. So let's I'm unshaven today, so I feel rough and ready to talk about our topic. So excited to be here.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I don't know if you have an inclination of where to start, but I think the two main avenues we could kind of go here is obviously there's the Gnostic Gospel of Mary, but then also there's what we see of Mary Magdalene in the Canonical Gospels as well. So do you have an inclination of where you'd like to pick up our discussion?
I think it's, I feel like it always start with what's sort of generally accepted, but I do think it is important to talk about some of these Gnostic Gospels and these other the particularly early witnesses to how Mary Magdalene was considered in the early church.
Mm-hmm.
And a good way to do that is through some of these Gnostic Gospels. So I think both are good, but I think it's always good to start with what's more generally accepted.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot in the Gospels as well, in terms of particularly when we really sort of view the progression from the oldest Gospels to the youngest Gospels, how Mary's story sort of changes as time passes between the actual writing of the Gospels. So how does that sound?
That sounds wonderful to me. And let's just start there. What have you noticed about her story as the timeline shifts and changes? Because of course, I know like with the actual resurrection story, the further away we get in time, the more and more spiritual and fantastical the narrative of Jesus and the resurrection gets. Have you noticed something similar with Mary's story?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so a couple of key things I think that are important to keep at the front of our mind in this. Number one is that one thing that cannot be questioned, I think, from the Gospels is two things. First, that Mary Magdalene was absolutely a devoted follower of Jesus throughout all of the Gospels. One of his strongest devotees, I would say, and also the very first witness to his resurrection, which I think is very powerful. From a historical perspective, in Luke, she's noted as one from whom 7 demons had gone out. Is one description of her. The name Magdalene likely comes from the Magdala, is what I read, or Magdala in Galilee, and just as a way of distinguishing her from other Marys. But it's also interesting how there was this group of women disciples who followed Jesus, and they're not talked about too much. Mary Magdalene definitely, like, most prominently, but they also provided, interestingly, even in the early Gospels, Mary was playing this role as the other women who were following Jesus as providers to Jesus's ministry, which is very interesting. Even more so than the male disciples, the female disciples were really providing for them out of their resources. So once again, showing to me that almost mothering, kind of that feminine providing, caring for energy. So that's one thing I've noticed, or I think is important to say. Secondly, is that unlike the male disciples, for the most part, most of the male disciples, Mary Magdalene, as well as some of the other women, stayed throughout the crucifixion. 3 Gospels explicitly name her as watching the cross from afar, and she also witnessed Jesus' burial, and John puts her at the right foot of the cross, right at the foot of the cross, rather, right by Jesus' mom at the time. And so again, so she's very loyal as well. So those are a few things that come up for me. I don't know. Is anything? How does that? I don't know. We'll start there, and I'm curious what you take away from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things, because every time you return to different stories, you always glean something new, right? It's like when you go back to your old favorite book, it's like, oh, I totally missed this. Or you watch a movie for the second or third time and it's like, oh, and there's this other thing too. And one of those things for me in returning to the story of Mary Magdalene is the word Magdalene and the fact that it is Mary from Magdala, and that Magdala is a town. That word in, I believe, the Hebrew means tower, and the town was known for having this really tall tower. And there was just something so striking about that to me, that it's like Mary from this town that has this big tower. And of course, it made me think of the tarot. The tower card is so enigmatic in the tarot. When I first studied and learned the practice of tarot, I was told, it's the worst card in the deck. It's the only bad card. And of course now there's no bad cards. Every card has a light and a shadow aspect to it. Every card has different messages and learnings. And the tower, while yes, it does represent destruction in a lot of ways, which is necessary for construction, it also can represent divine epiphanies. In the card, we see lightning striking the top of this dome, and it just was such a kind of profound moment for me. And that's so interesting that it's like Mary from the town of epiphanies, Mary from the town of like radical lightning striking, and how that can be so destructive to so many things. Like poets that come before their time and wanting to bring radical ideas is destructive in a certain way to the status quo. And I think this dives a little bit into more of the Gnostic Gospels and things that aren't as discursive in the canon. But knowing that she is a woman and one of Jesus' most devoted disciples, and that there is just this feeling of transformation and kind of being a messenger of radical knowledge is just something that I really associate with her. And so I found that really powerful. And I think also your point about her being an extremely devoted disciple and the one who found the tomb empty, right? These are the things that are so important about her narrative and her story. And whether or not, like, there's not much about her in the canonical gospels. Like, there's a lot there to discuss and unfold, but it's like in terms of actual, like, where she's mentioned, where her name is written, not nearly as much as the other disciples. But knowing that she is the one who found the tomb empty and was the messenger to the disciples of the empty tomb. This is something I was listening to Dr. Bart Ehrman's discussion of Mary Magdalene, because I love his work. I think he's wonderful, especially when it comes to biblical scholarship. And one thing that he said that I just thought was so profound, and I never thought about it in this way, was the difference between a disciple and an apostle is that a disciple is a student of someone. An apostle is a messenger. It quite literally means to send. So if you're an apostle of someone, you are being sent out to spread the message. And so as Jesus' disciples become apostles, Mary is the first apostle. She's the apostle to the apostles.
Mm-hmm.
as she sends the
I love that. Yeah.
message to everybody, the tomb is empty. And it, I get goosebumps talking about it, because it's like, to even within literature have that power on a woman, right? Which, of course, in actual historic culture, we know that women were the ones that would go and dress the tomb. So it would be weird if it wasn't women going and dressing the tomb the 3 days later, right? So I don't know, maybe the author's hands were forced in this way, that it's like, well, we need it to be a woman that discovers the tomb empty, right? But still, to have that power of, like, arguably kind of the first Christian, it's like being a woman, that it's just so cool to me.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, in John, Jesus says, she's at the tomb, she mistakes him for a gardener, and then
Mm-hmm.
he calls her name, and she says, teacher, rabbi, and he then Jesus then commissions her and says specifically, go to my brothers and tell them I'm ascending to my father and your father. So she was the first to announce, and this idea of apostle being one who is sent. She was commissioned, right? That is exactly true. She was sent with good news, and it is, I think Thomas Aquinas basically said I think you use the language as well, but I love it. Apostle to the apostles. And again, it's a woman who's an apostle to the apostles, which is pretty radical. Given that historically at that time period, women were not considered necessarily, no one would really invent that story, of course, is one of the
Right.
apologetic arguments. Um, Nevertheless, though, I think regardless of the veracity, and regardless of whether we take this as actual fact or it's allegory, right? I think there is a message here in that the most unlikely vessels could maybe be used to see divine truth, and
Yeah.
that so Mary was really being used here, and I think it's something to keep in mind, like that her voice mattered once again,
Yeah.
her voice above all others. And why? Because she showed up, like she was the first at the tomb. And I think it's just an interesting message in terms of show up. Like when you
Right.
show up, your voice matters, and so I love that.
Yeah, I love that too. It's like, she showed up. She was the one who was there. She was devoted. She was at the foot of the cross with Mother Mary, right? And it, there's also something that's coming up for me, that's like this feeling of believing women too, right? That it's like, today we have, especially when it comes to sexual assault and female narratives, and like within healthcare as well, that like when women report pain, they're often dismissed. Like when women report assault, their stories are completely undermined. And this is the most radical, the most unbelievable story. And yet you need to believe the woman to believe it, right? And then, of course, everyone races to the tomb to see for themselves, but she is the first, and she is the apostle to the apostles. I think there is something too about like the special relationship that is kind of discussed between Mary and Jesus. And it's interesting to me that like, you're always told there's 12 disciples, but then we hear that there's these three other women that kind of follow them around, and it's Mary, Susanna, and oh, I'm going to forget the third one's name, but Mary Magdalene is in this group of three women that are also there. And it's like, so it's not even technically one of the disciples that discovers Jesus, but it's Mary. But she was also there following, in a literal sense, but also in this metaphorical sense, the teachings and preachings.
And you could say she persisted in her belief, right? Which is stuff we've talked about before. Like even death wasn't enough to dissuade her from her persistence in showing up, which I think is pretty amazing, really, when you put it out there, that the individual who showed the most persistence, who showed the most belief and dedication, wasn't one of the disciples, wasn't Peter, wasn't, the rock, who Jesus called the rock, right? No, it was Mary Magdalene who showed up and who believed and who persisted. And was her voice was the voice to the apostles. It's actually very powerful when you reframe it in that way.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting. And I think, we talked a little bit about the non-canonical gospels, right? And I think that we've kind of talked about what really happened. There, like you said, there's not a whole lot in the gospels in terms of. I think we've largely talked about her. What's. I think it is interesting how she's referred to as having 7 demons taken from her, and I kind of view that in 2 ways. One is again, just the demonizing of women, right? So, oh, well, she had demons, she had to be and I think that's something that unfortunately still exists today. I know people who, when they were kids, had depression, or were teenagers, had angst, and they were thought to be demonically possessed by their parents, and that still happens. And so I don't know. There's something about the fact that in Luke she's presented as having 7 demons cast out of her that is also kind of interesting to me, because Luke is one of the later, is not the first. I mean, John is the latest gospel, but Mark was first, and Luke certainly came after, likely Matthew and Mark, I think. But it's just interesting, again, this friction there, having being healed, having 7 demons cast out of her. On the other hand, though, it also shows that how life-changing that could be, how she then took something, again, if you follow the allegory, she was redeemed, and then look at what she was able to accomplish because she walked in the light of that redemption. Again, so I kind of see both ways of it, but I don't know. Have you what comes up for you with that too?
Yeah.
Before we turn to sort of the because there's a lot of interesting stuff in the Gnostic Gospels, and I think it gives us a better picture of how the early church thought about Mary Magdalene versus sort of what happened down the road. But before we go there, I'm just curious if that brings up this, because women often get thought of being demonically possessed, right? In a lot of ways, that's something that's been labeled.
Oh yeah. And one thing we talked about with Jezebel as well that I think we absolutely see in the mythology of Mary Magdalene is how when women are demonized, it's almost always tied to sexual impurity as well. That there's some sort of promiscuousness, lack of chastity that is also thrust upon them. And obviously, I think Mary Magdalene as a figure in the Bible is so mythologized, right? There's the idea that there's not very much in the canonical gospels, and yet we have all of these ideas and notions, and she was Jesus's wife, she was this prostitute, she had these all of these things. It's there's so much story around her. And one thing that I think is so fascinating is the way that so many women in the Bible are kind of just wrapped up as oh, well, that was Mary Magdalene. And we actually don't have proof of that. But I've heard the woman in the he who is without sin throw this first stone story. I've heard someone say, oh yeah, that's about Mary Magdalene. I've heard someone say that the prostitute that weeps at Jesus' feet and cleans his hair or his feet with her hair, that's Mary Magdalene. And that's why we get this narrative that Mary Magdalene is a prostitute. And it's why? There's an interesting thing that happens where all of these kind of women that exist in the Bible are just lumped into one figure, one woman, which I think is interesting and diminishing of the idea that oh, well, all women are the same. All of these women in all of these stories must be sexually impure. And if we're talking about the redemption of a prostitute, well, then they're just all basically the same woman. It's hang on. That's a weird thing that you're doing. Let's think about this. And even if you want to say it's the same archetype or it's the same metaphor, sure, maybe. And I think the danger with this is that even if people aren't intentionally like trying to lump all women together, or aren't intentionally trying to say any woman that's depicted as impure in the Bible is automatically sexually impure as well. The idea that it even happens slowly and surely over time is indicative of this undermining nature that happens and this dehumanization that does happen of women. And now, in modern day, even though Mary is the apostle to the apostles, the biggest question about her is if she's Jesus' wife. And it's like,
Right.
does that actually matter? One, there's no proof or evidence of it at all. And it's very much like we see this happen in media all the time, where someone gets married and it's like, oh, well, I'm going to talk about them as this person's wife, not as themselves. And when men get married, that very rarely happens, unless it's like the woman is extremely famous and they marry a non-celebrity. It's like, oh, well, then you're the celebrity's husband. But if two celebrities get together, the woman is immediately tied to the man, and they'll get questions all the time about their husband. And even like, I think the example that's coming to mind is Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds. And while I'm not the biggest fan of either of them, it's interesting that Blake Lively is constantly asked about Ryan Reynolds and what's your husband up to and all of these things. And it's, well, you're Ryan Reynolds' wife. And we don't really hear the same narrative around, well, you're Blake Lively's husband. Sure, it happens sometimes.
Right, exactly.
But it's like, to look at the canonical figure of Mary Magdalene that discovered the tomb empty and say, but was she married? It's just like,
right.
What are we doing?
Right, who was... Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting, you know, this whole, you know, the early church felt very differently about Mary Magdalene, it seems, at least based on these Gnostic Gospels, than, you know, kind of we did later. And it's in 591 AD. This really seems to be because of Pope Gregory the Great. In 591 AD, and he's the one who, in a famous sermon, conflated Mary Magdalene
all of these
with
women,
these other, you know, Mary of Bethany, who's the sister of Martha and Lazarus. So that Mary, remember in John, as well as the unnamed sinful woman in Luke 7. Who bathed Jesus's feet with her tears. And he basically said, no, these are all one person, from whom 7 devils, again, we get back to this devils thing, from whom 7 devils were ejected. And so, you know, and he went even further, which is where we sort of get this prostitute myth, right? Which is to say, you know, she'd use the perfume to perfume her flesh in forbidden acts before repenting. And so that for 1400 years, basically, Mary Magdalene's been branded as a repentant prostitute. You know, so again, the classic archetype again of the redeemed harlot, right? So the hooker with a heart of gold, the pretty woman, right? And you know, and I think it's just important to notice that and to call that out. How and it's only recently I think that's been changed, and in fact I think Pope Francis made her the day celebrating her a saint equal to the male apostles as well. So things are changing over more recent times, but it's just interesting how one sermon changed how Mary was thought about for thousands of years, which is kind of wild if you think about it. At least in the Catholic Church, it's also important to point out that the Eastern Orthodox Church, for example, never did this. So this was done by Pope Gregory and kind of came into the zeitgeist, of course, because of Western Europe and Catholicism and so forth. But, you know, other Christian traditions don't view Mary in the same way that this lens that got put on her, which I think is something to just point out. So yeah, I think that's a super important. I think it's so important for us to separate truth from, you know, sort of common knowledge, I guess, if you will. So what does, and that's my issue. Like, examine the text. There's nowhere in the Bible that even remotely suggests any of of the scandalous that somehow Mary Magdalene was anything other than a devoted follower of Jesus who, he helped her in some way through some healing and changed her life, whether, demonic possession or otherwise. But she felt, and she paid it forward and was a loyal follower even unto his death and beyond. That's all the Bible really says about Mary. Yet we've come up with all of these other things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when you lay it out like that, it's like, wow. I don't know. It makes me think.
Right. Well, and I
even
think,
just in laying it out like.
Yeah, what you said about how it was Pope Gregory that did this, and even though it's, yes, in Catholic tradition, it has become kind of the narrative that is in the zeitgeist. And it's like, we want to talk about, like, in Christian circles, it's very much like, go back to the text. What does the Bible say? What did Jesus preach? And we need to go to the canon. And especially as we're about to get into this Gnostic gospel that isn't considered canon in Western Christianity, and there are still these narratives that are like, well, that's not canon either, and it's bought. It's totally accepted as truth, as a part of the stories that are told, the apologetics that are woven around the narrative of Jesus, that she was a sex worker. And I think one, of course, it just bears noting, like, even if Mary was a sex worker, doesn't diminish her devotion to Christ, doesn't diminish being the apostle to the apostles, but certainly in the eyes of Christianity, that lowers her status. It makes her sinful and impure. And by those standards, it makes it easier to dismiss a woman. It's like, well, she was a sex worker, so yeah, Jesus saved her, but, like, she's still a woman. And it is interesting how even the disciples, like, we have the tax collector, right? That's, like, not painted in a very nice light, and yet it's more kind of hand waved away, the things that other disciples do. And women are always tied with sexual impurity. And part of me with sex work too, and how it's represented in the Bible, is that it's just always placed on the women, and we need to cast out these 7 demons from the women. It's like, well, who's going to her? Who's paying her for her services? Right, yes. And of course that may seem like an obvious point.
They're being tempted. But those men are being tempted.
Right.
Those men are being tempted. And,
it repaints
obviously the devil is using Mary as the vehicle of temptation, right? That's the story.
Yes,
that's the story, and they're sticking to it, right?
Right. I think it really repaints the canonical narrative in a modern light. It's really looking at it through the lens that modern puritanical evangelical Christians want to proliferate, the message that they want to send, whether or not they actually believe it's grounded in the text or not, if it's just what they were told growing up. It's like, until I started doing my own research into biblical scholarship, I didn't know Mary actually wasn't a sex worker. I thought she was growing up, because that was just what was told. And I think probably most Christians have that view, or at least think that is somewhere in the Gospels, even though there is absolutely no textual proof or evidence there. And so when we're talking about, accuracy, canonization of stories, and trustworthiness of narratives that you're basing your entire life on, I think it just bears noting, like, no matter what holy text you may be analyzing or choosing to integrate into your worldview, into your faith system, it always comes down to your analysis of it, and you need to be careful of what other people tell you about it, and you need to be doing the research and work yourself. And even the Pope Gregory, the leader of this text, was wrong. So it's like, do your own research. And I think part of my own research that I've really loved is reading the Gnostic Gospel of Mary. I think it is one of the most beautiful Gnostic Gospels and the narrative we get around her relationship with Jesus in this gospel is just so profound to me, and really it's potent, I think is the word I want to use. The narratives that we really get here. Yeah, so I guess I'll toss it back to you with any immediate reactions and then initial thoughts about the Gnostic Gospel.
Yeah, I think I think it's so interesting because, first of all, the Mary is mentioned in several Gnostic texts, and she's the only gospel named for a woman. So the Gospel of Mary, which is a second century text, and so it's just interesting how she's portrayed here, and which is a good example of how the early church, felt, at least portions of the early church, felt and viewed her role, who she was, and what she brought, compared to something, essentially 500 or 600 years down the road. And so in this gospel, and I just to tee it up for you, Reese, because it is so profound for you, and I'd rather you would be the one to share your passion for it. But essentially, the Gospel of Mary portrays her as having received unique teachings from Jesus and being an encourager to the male disciples who are all scared. And there's some striking things that occur in this, where two of the male disciples, Andrew and Peter, get angry at her trying to teach them. Basically saying, Peter asking questions like, did he actually speak with a woman and not to us? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So now we're supposed to listen to her. He chose her over us. And it's just interesting. And he's rebuked as well. And so it does certainly suggest that Mary was a teacher and had a very prominent role. And so it's just interesting to me, and I'll tee it up for you to talk more about it, that we're so ready. We were, as an entire culture, as a humanity, we're at least in the Western world, we're so ready to believe something that one man said versus, gospels and things that were written hundreds of years before that actually show a different tale. Yet what sticks? Well, the fact that she was a sex worker. That's just interesting to me. But what was your revelation, I guess? Tell us more about sort of your connection to the Gospel of Mary and what it meant for you.
Yeah, I think firstly, learning that it was the first gospel that I learned wasn't included in the Gospels. And I remember the first time I learned that the Bible wasn't fully the Bible. It's like there are people picking and choosing what to include in a holy text. Hang on. And so it was firstly this one of the first moments of questioning for me, not just of the church, but of the history of Christianity and how we practice religion and how messages are passed down, and who can we trust? Who do we trust? And why do we put so much trust into governing organizations, right, that have a vested interest in maintaining power and financial control, and that do really bad things to other groups of people? And it's kind of suspicious that the moral code is being dictated by the people already in power. And so I first dived into it just with a voracious curiosity for, what are they hiding from us? What are these people keeping from us? Because there's a reason that it wasn't originally included. And then also, I believe it wasn't published until the 1950s, I want to say. And it was discovered in Germany. And I think, of course, because of World War II and all of the horrible atrocities that happened in Germany, leading up to when the gospel was discovered, there's some murky history with how it actually came about, how we rediscovered it. And how it became published, but it opens up with this conversation, and immediately Mary, the other apostles are like, well, you got this secret teaching from Jesus that we didn't get? And Mary's like, well, yeah. She's just very like blasé about it. And they're like, well, tell us. And then we don't have like 3 pages. And there is just something, but before we started recording, we were talking about making meaning out of things. And I'm like, there is something so divine to me about the idea of a gospel where this one woman receives secret teachings from arguably the most important man in history. And we don't have what he said. The text is gone. The words are gone. And we will never find them. Of course, it kicks back in. We get like the ending of what Mary shares with the apostles. That is this narrative about, it's very Gnostic in, the soul is trying to reach the level of heaven, and you need to ascend through these 7 layers of heaven, which is interesting with the parallel with casting out of the 7 demons. So I think there's something noteworthy there. Of course, the number 7 is everywhere in the Bible, but noteworthy. And she ends with kind of describing the way that, the soul reaches the kingdom of heaven by casting out the earthly body and the earthly kind of sinful nature of the physical body, which is very Gnostic and fascinating to me in terms of like the way we philosophically conceptualize of mind-body dualism and how does the spirit interact with the physical body. And I just remember being so enamored with the fact that it's like, we're never going to have these secret teachings. And it's almost like this idea of like Yahweh is supposed to be this unspeakable name of God, and yet we've still come up with a way to pronounce it, right? When we say Yahweh, everyone who has any kind of interest in this scholarship and research knows exactly what we're talking about, and yet it's supposed to be unspeakable. But when you put things into discursive language, like we were talking about earlier too, the way we use words shifts and changes over time, and how you use words impacts the meaning of those words too. And the same thing with names, and the name of God having changed and evolved. There's no way this secret teaching could really have changed and evolved because we actually don't know it. And it's very much, it is unspeakable. And if these few passages being missing from the gospel aren't divine intervention, I don't know what is, because I would absolutely hate to see what some people would twist what is written in this portion of the gospel into. But actually what we get is this divine mystery, which I'm like, mystery is the most powerful thing to me. And I love that it's a group of men being like, please tell us what he told you. And she's like, okay, I'll tell you. But I have the secrets, and even though she, there is this lack of belief there, just the energy that the figure of Mary Magdalene carries in the gospel, and in the Gospel of Philip too, there's some really interesting descriptions of her, and I believe that's actually where a lot of this myth around Mary Magdalene and Jesus being married is, because there's this idea of like the kissing that they would do. But of course, kissing even on the mouth was a Christian practice, because it's like you're passing the breath, you're passing revelation, you're passing spirit to one another through the act of a kiss. But just opening on this powerful figure, and it's like a woman is holding court about spiritual truth. And it's so good. And I love that it stayed mysterious, but also more and more people are talking about it and talking about the way that this woman, even though she's been labeled a prostitute, sexually impure, had these 7 demons, like we have this other narrative of her being kind of the chosen one. That's just really beautiful to me. And I think the spiritual kind of idea that she passes down is also really, really fascinating. I have some issues with Gnosticism, but for the most part, I actually think that it's a really beautiful depiction of Christianity too. So there's also that piece. But I just talked for so long about these things. What do you think, Dennis? What do all of these things bring up for you?
There's a definite, to me, throughout the Gnostic Gospels, I mean, especially the Gospel of Mary, but Philip and a few of the others, there's a tension. And, it's funny, earlier we were talking about tension, right? Before we started this. And it's funny how this theme comes back. There's this tension between, men, this pattern, right, of Peter, who's famously sort of the archetype for the brash guy, right? And he's constantly, but even other disciples dismissing these revelations. To me, I think this reflects probably the tension, even at the time, of a woman being equal in power or equal or surpassing, really, if she has secret teachings of Jesus. And Jesus loved her more than anyone else, as it said. It suggests in the Philip, the Gospel of Philip, and it just shows to me the clear tension of a strong female disciple's voice being challenged by male authority, and what that says again about the insecurity there. All of these, her influence was later downplayed, and it clearly, to me, made people uncomfortable. I think it's also interesting that, you mentioned the passages in the Gospel of Philip that kind of, pointed towards, well, maybe there was a relationship between Jesus and Mary, but there's no explicit claim to that. No early Christian text suggests any more than we've talked about that there was some that they were married or that he was. But it's interesting how it's just interesting to me that there's even a need to do this, like, and it goes back to what you pointed out before, like, why is it better? What does it do to make Mary Jesus's wife? Like, why is that something that comes up for people? Like, why is that something we naturally need to do when it's never mentioned explicitly? And yes, it says he loved her more than anyone, so they must have been married. Like, that's an interesting leap. Like, I don't know. So those are the two things I think that come up for me, and it does lead me to a question, frankly, of how would our world be different if Mary's voice had been given equal weight to Peter's voice from the start? Like, how would our world today, Christianity today, be different if we had done that?
Yeah. Wow. What a beautiful question. I would like to see that, and just sitting with that for a second. I think there would be a lot more things that maybe today we consider woo-woo are probably a bit more accepted, because in the Gnostic Gospels there is this kind of like mystical element to Mary's teachings and to what it's said that Jesus taught Mary specifically and in secret, and just told Mary about this kind of other dimension of Christianity. And with this idea of like, why do we need Mary to be married, right? Like, why, if Jesus loves her so much, does that necessarily mean that they're married? And I think it even shows the way in history, like the idea of marriage being something that the church promotes is not rooted in Christian history or the Bible. Jesus, by all accounts, was a single man. And if anything, Gnostic believers, and I think oh, there's a certain sect that I'm going to forget the word of, but there was a sect around the time that Jesus was preaching that believed you shouldn't get married because this sect believed in resurrection. And when you're resurrected to enter into the kingdom of heaven, because there's the practice of if you as a man die, your brother or the next in line must marry your wife and you produce a child. And so if that happens, where you're married, you never had a child, you die, your wife needs to remarry your brother, he dies, all three of you are resurrected in heaven. Okay, well, who's married to who now? It actually creates a lot of complication. And there's more difficulty there. And as you're trying to get to the state of heaven, I believe there's actually a verse. You may know this, Dennis, because you're better at the verses than I am, but of Jesus saying, like, we must be like the angels who are not in marriage with one another. And yet there's other parts of the Bible where it talks about marriage as actually being a divine union between the Holy Spirit and the disciple, right? That, like, that is what true marriage is. So there's a bunch of different definitions of marriage. And I think this move towards wanting to make Mary and Jesus married is kind of a projected narrative for some of these kind of societal desires that the people in power have, right? It's like marriage is a tool of the patriarchy. It's the tool of passing women as ownership. And if Jesus never got married, if Mary, his favorite disciple, never got married, well, that looks kind of problematic if we want women to be passed as property from man to man. So we need to come up with some way to communicate that marriage is actually a holy thing that God has ordered, that God has commanded of his followers. And we don't really see that, and yet that is a message that is communicated. And as I'm saying this, I'm aware that I'm kind of communicating something that sounds very intentional, like there was someone at some point who decided that this was the message that we want to communicate to, like, control women. And I don't think it's that intentional. I do think it's small choices by large groups of people over time, but that's why paying attention to these things is so important, so that these small movements, it's like the small choices and small steps do add up to big consequences.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it is interesting, right? Because on one sense, you could argue that this call it a trope, right? This idea that Mary had to be Jesus's wife. What does that do? What does that serve to do? I mean, yes, you have the promoting of marriage, perhaps in some ways, which do kind of run counter to Jesus's teachings, and certainly counter to Paul's teachings, who wrote most of the New Testament, where Paul, neither Jesus nor Paul, at least in the canonical Gospels and in Paul's writing, seem to really be very much concerned about marriage and relationship. The Sadducees, I believe you mentioned, brought the
Yes.
story of the man who had 7 brothers, and Jesus is like, you don't really understand what's going on. You're not asking the right questions. Like you're asking silly questions, essentially, is what Jesus is saying there. And so that's, but one thing it does do that it occurs to me is if you think about it, right, in going back to what the Gospel of Mary, where she's like, hey, here's what Jesus told me, and Peter's like, well, why would he tell you that? Well, it kind of takes the focus away from Mary's own inherent worthiness to, well, the only reason, Jesus did, maybe he told her some things, but he did because, he married her. It was, you tell your spouse, it really, to me, sort of diminishes her own value by defining her in the context of a sexual relationship with Jesus, which I think is kind of interesting. Like she can't, it's not enough for her to be worthy on her own. She couldn't possibly be worthy in the absence of a man. Is one interpretation that I feel could be taken from it for sure.
Yeah. Well, and it minimizes it with let's just pillow talk.
Exactly. It takes away from who she is as a person. And again, it goes back to what you were saying about celebrities, right? Well, so and so is the wife of the man. Well, okay, yeah, she knows stuff because she was Jesus's wife. That's the only reason. And you tell things to your, that's okay. It's. I think it is just interesting. When you call these things out, and it's just interesting though how again. So we have this oscillation too between we go from the she was a vilified as a prostitute, right? So she was the redeemed whore, or so we have that extreme. Or she was Jesus's wife. So now it goes back to this Madonna, right? Madonna or whore, right? So we even see this in Mary Magdalene. So she was either Jesus's secret wife, and that's romantic. Wow, Jesus loved her so much, but is on the down low. Or she was a hooker, but she really meant well, and Jesus cleansed her of that. And maybe cleansed her enough to marry her. I mean, it's just so fascinating to see how the history, how history came about and how these stories came about. And yeah, I mean, Paul, it's so clear in Paul's writing, his whole view of relationships and Jesus to some degree as well, they both thought the world was ending in a few years. Yeah. So there was no, Mary, Paul is basically like Jesus, this is so dumb to think about. The world's ending and all you care about is banging other people. Well, fine, right. If you need to get married, but now look at all of the stuff that changes about marriage is generally the things that were written later because they're trying to grow this religion and, not marrying and not having sex is not a great way to grow your religion, it turns out. So you basically see Christianity becoming more marketable to non-Christian people. So you started with this group of fanatics who were like, hell yeah, guys, let's cut off our balls for Jesus. And then it's like, well, maybe we don't need to do that. It's kind of hard to get new people in here when we're saying you shouldn't have relationships. It's not a good thing. We need to change our messaging. Yeah. Kind of like we need to change our messaging here, guys.
We need a rebrand.
We need a rebrand. They hired, Mackenzie to come in and help them rebrand. And it's like, no, we like marriage now. It's good. Yes. It's just, I don't know. I do that tongue in cheek sometimes, but is it so far from the truth, I suppose?
Right.
We're just putting it in modern language, but,
yeah.
And so, I mean, I think another thing we could look at too is, I mean, just how Mary's image evolved in overtime, right? So we sort of talked, so we have this early vision, right? I mean, we have the Bible basically just showing Mary as a very devoted, persistent follower who was the announcer, who was the first apostle to the apostles. Then we see in the Gnostic Gospels that she had wisdom. She was able to teach. She was an encourager of the men. So you have anxious Peter and his fear, and she's here to help the disciples. Then a few hundred years later, we have this penitent Mary show up because of Pope Gregory, and this composite Magdalene image, disciple, harlot. They all become intertwined, and again, it's this. What is it? It's again. What is it telling women? She was this, but she cast all of this aside, and now she became the perfect obedient vessel. It goes back to this: who's vilified, who's venerated, and in this case, she's venerated because she's the redeemed sinner. And then now I think I think we're actually having her reputation restored over more modern times. And again, I think I mentioned Pope Francis. And looking here, I'm seeing in 2016 her memorial was elevated to a feast on par with the male apostles, which is interesting. And this was just 9 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So really, and in fact, and I'm quoting this now, the Vatican decree celebrated Mary Magdalene as the apostle of the apostles, highlighting how Jesus, quote, entrusted to Mary Magdalene first the joyful news of the resurrection. So she was the first to get that news. So in other words, she is the Catholic Church officially said that Mary Magdalene is an evangelist, because that's what an evangelist is one who shares the good news. So it's interesting that we've actually, more so I think than any of perhaps the other women we've talked about, certainly Jezebel, right, whose name has not been redeemed. I think there has been some redemption, which I think is a really positive thing. I don't know. What have you noticed? I mean, what does that spark in you, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I do think that over time it is interesting to see, because we talked about this a little bit with Jezebel too, and how time really changes the stories. And, we know oral tradition and word of mouth, these things kind of gain momentum in different ways. It's historical telephone. And I do think that Mary has become it's interesting because her, almost more than any of the actual canonical biblical women, maybe Mother Mary a little bit too, but is also venerated in metaphysical, spiritual, New Age spaces. That Mary Magdalene is this kind of spiritual, almost deity that you could do deity work with for like deep metaphysical work that is separate from Christianity. And I think it's really interesting to see how people from other traditions, or that adopt their own version of practices, have really, and I would put myself in this category, have really flocked isn't the right word, but like felt called to Mary Magdalene. And I do think there is something about this idea of the spiritual pilgrimage that is almost always depicted as a masculine figure, and seeing someone like Mary that is like indoctrinated into the secret spiritual teachings, that's really exciting for women. And I will say almost no other figure, I think, has been kind of redeemed in this way. Like, their story has been reframed both in Christian religious world and in the spiritual world. Like, we have Lilith has become this huge name and great deity that's been, I almost don't want to say redeemed, because part of it is that she's a dark goddess, but absolutely worshipped in spiritual communities, but certainly not in like traditional religious communities, right? And then you have other figures like Mother Mary, who, yes, some people do have spiritual, I would say I have a spiritual practice with Mother Mary, but it's certainly more in the traditional Christian Catholic sense of, you got to say your Hail Marys. You have to worship Mother Mary. It's all of that good stuff is certainly how her energy is usually worked with. And Mary Magdalene is really used in both worlds. And I don't think we've seen that for any of these other biblical womanhood figures. And I think as well, when we think about prophets and when we think about, poets who come before their time, it's always a man. And I've been thinking about this a lot with like even the picture of the hermit, and in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it's the old wise sage that goes up into the mountain and gets the teachings and then comes back down with his lantern lit to share the message with the community. And he's decried a god and a madman, right? It's like you're both and. But Mary Magdalene, I think, is the closest figure we have to that is a woman. And there's no women prophets. There's just not. And that's something that I think I have really been thinking about recently, and it's like even Baha'i, one of the fastest growing religions in the world that uplifts all prophets, right? Historically, they believe that all prophets are messengers of the same God, and their overall teaching is that all spiritual and religious teachings are moving us towards universal truth and unity, love, consciousness, which is actually a very beautiful teaching. But even if you look at the list of prophets that are like all of the ones that are venerated, they're all men. And sure, we have Isis and Kuan Yin and Bastet and Lilith, and there's these deities that are womanly. Mary is the only one that I have found that is a messenger from God in this kind of Western sense, that is a historical figure, a historical human figure that is a woman. And I don't know. I just think that it's important to note that. And I'm like, I want a woman prophet. I want a woman prophet, damn it.
That's so powerful. No, I think that's so powerful because I think you can view, and I do, I think this whole rebranding of and even the emphasis of Mary Magdalene having demons cast out of her and having to be redeemed, and this rebranding as a prostitute, to me this is a symbolic act of erasure and violence. Yeah. It takes a woman who was the first evangelist, the first
she
one
was
sent,
a prophet, yeah,
and had messages from the Savior, right? According to the according to the Gospel of Mary, and took her and reframed her a church leader as a cautionary tale of sin. Now, what does this do? It ensures that any woman aspiring to leadership in the church would have a tarnished archetype, because it's not enough you're not enough alone. You have to be redeemed. You have to. She couldn't, this narrative of sexuality had to be constructed, or she would have been too powerful. So I don't think it's an accident. All of this serves to neutralize the threat that her leadership poses to a male power structure, right? Again, it always is about this power. Where does the power come from? And I think exactly what you said is true. If when we choose to see Mary and highlight and reframe and reclaim Mary as an apostle, as a prophet, it's a way for women today to reclaim symbolically that authority and that voice taken from them over the years. So, this really, to me, when we make Mary Magdalene visible, I think it makes all women visible. It allows. I think her story, and I honestly am deeply inspired in some senses by her story. 'Cause I thought I knew the story of Mary, but in preparing for our conversation today and doing some reading and looking things up, I really realized the strength of her testimony. Again, she showed up. She was so devoted. She was so persistent. And isn't that, don't women have to be that way today? They have to be persistent, right? Because that's what society, and I don't know. I think there is something so powerful there, particularly those who felt marginalized in religious or spiritual spaces. Mm-hmm. I don't know. That's what really comes up for me. I think by highlighting Mary in the way we're doing and others are doing today as a courageous messenger and a beloved disciple, I think we give you, me, everyone, all women especially, but everyone in the world, a biblical foremother they can look up to in some ways.
Yeah.
Like I would love, it would be wonderful to be, we should aspire, all of us, I should aspire, you should aspire to be like Mary, like to be so devoted, even through death. What a story, what a courage. And to speak even in the face of his disciples poo-pooing you. And there's no evidence in any of this that she was like, lording this over them. She was very much like, never. Hey, let me share what I know. Like, this is for everyone. It's just, I don't know. I think it's powerful. How does that land with you?
I completely agree. And I love that how you said it allows us to kind of reclaim this narrative in a really powerful way. And it makes me think of one kind of tangent that I thought of was also the way that, like, by this being a woman who wasn't married either, it also allows for, there's just such liberation in that. And I just keep going back to that. But in the way that it's like you said, she was a beloved disciple. Why does your beloved have to be a sexual partner? And I think that just goes to show how much we center romantic relationships and sexual intimacy in our society, and that it's like, marriage is what you do, having kids is what you do, it's what it is expected, not just religiously but like culturally. And I'm like, I love this idea of them having this deep spiritual relationship that is not sexual or romantic at all. It is a profound kinship, and you can hold someone as your beloved, but not be married. It's like that is so possible. But the main thing that what you just said called up for me, it made me think of Joan of Arc and Salem witch trials, and how many women could be prophets that are actually called crazy, right? When they have spiritual downloads and messages. And I think we see this throughout history, that it's men who say that they hear the voice of God are given power, money, and notoriety. Women who hear the voice of God are called crazy, depicted as an old, ugly hag with warts and a broken nose that has a gross laugh and is going to eat your children. It's like, hang on.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well said.
What are we doing here?
Unfortunately, well said. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that is unfortunately. Again, I'm struck by the strength and resilience in this story, right? I mean, it's this journey from, if you even just looking, going through all the both the canonical as well as sort of what we're gleaning from the Gnostic text, we have this journey, right? It starts from deliverance, right? So she had 7 demons, again, metaphorically. So we start with deliverance, then we move to devotion. So she was a devoted, she was actually a patron in some senses of Jesus. Like, she wasn't just a disciple. She gave to his ministry. She supported him. She was a patron. So you have deliverance, you have devotion, then you have persistence. This persistence even through death in following, in this devotion. So you have this persistent belief. And then lastly, you move from deliverance to devotion, to persistence and belief. And then lastly, to daring and courageous, to being a daring and courageous messenger. She's the one who was sent. And what a journey that is. And I guess, I don't know, hearing that, it inspires me in my own journey of being a leader, of being somebody, of being a helper, of being a coach, of being, in all these different roles. Can I be as courageous and persistent as Mary, is what comes up for me, even in the face of such such an attempt to silence and to distort the truth. I don't know how to, I don't know, that's what comes up for me. I mean, her example of this, how does that land with you? What does it bring up for you in your own spiritual or leadership journey? I'm curious.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you just said. And I suppose I'll just add one layer that came up for me, which is the self-affirmation piece. That is, once Jesus is gone and resurrected and in heaven with the Trinity, reunited with the Trinity, and the Mary is still sharing her knowledge in spite of Jesus' disciples questioning her and questioning the message, that it doesn't matter. She's like, I know my truth. I know what Jesus told me. I know what I believe. I know what I am going to follow because this is what makes me a spiritual person, the best version of myself, the wholest, most true version of myself, and step into truth that she knows, right? And her story really is one that does not rely on anyone else, maybe on Jesus, but no other figure. And it is the truth that was revealed to her through Jesus, partially, but also partially through that own self-affirmation that is, I know my truth, and I'll share it with you. You don't want to believe it. Hey, you know, take what you want, disciples and apostles. Like, you knew him too, but I did know him, and I know what I know. And that self-sovereignty piece, it's something we talk a lot about in the podcast, is I think just so reflected in this story. And I think so often when we feel, maybe this is just a self-report, but I think so often when we feel unempowered, when we do not believe in our own power, when we do not believe in our own sovereignty, we try so hard to convince other people of our truth because we're not the ones affirming it for ourselves. And in Mary just being like, yep, this is what I know. And then being like, I don't know. And it's like, okay. It's just like the ultimate, damn, like she believes it, you know? You don't need anything when you are your own rock. Like, yeah.
That's so true.
I completely agree with what you're saying.
So powerful. No. I think you brought out this may be the most important thing is you're right. Because how often if you believe something is true, you don't need to push your beliefs on other people. Like, you don't need to, it doesn't need to be conform or die. Like, if you don't, it's, hey, I know this is true. I'm secure in it. And people try to tear down that security because of their own insecurity, right? And so I do think it's just a beautiful display of security. Like, she is secure in her story. She is secure in the authority she's been given. And so she spoke her truth. And wow, I mean, how powerful. And again, I see it in two ways. I see both that dedication, right? Her faithfulness is really what gave her that truth, right? She got her truth through her faithfulness, through her devotion, through her, I don't know. I think there's something so powerful there. Thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah.
I hope our listeners, to me, that's what it's about. When you speak your truth, you don't have to worry about anyone hearing it, because your truth is there. It's alive.
Yeah.
And isn't that truly the gospel? So she was in some senses living the gospel, right? Her heart, her intuition, her belief was her gospel. She was a living embodiment of that. What a beautiful thing. What a model. Like,
yeah,
amazing that such a, when we really dig into this, it's amazing how you just what a role model, more so than I first imagined. So what a wonderful way of putting it.
Yeah. I think that's such a beautiful kind of note to end on here.
Yeah, I know. I don't know where to go from here.
I know. I'm like, I think that what you just said is like such a beautiful encapsulation of this conversation. But I suppose before we close out, is there anything else that we haven't touched on yet that we want to make sure we talk about with Mary Magdalene? I'm trying to think if there's anything that I was like, I want to make sure we talk about it. But I think we covered a good chunk.
I'm sure we missed some scholarly points we could have made, but honestly, I think the message to me is just so clear.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least what I take away from today is to just how powerful that devotion and belief and persistence is.
Mm-hmm.
And we need we need more women and men to be like Mary Magdalene. And
Yeah.
I hope this inspires people to
I
use
hope
their voice,
so.
because all of our listeners, your voice matters. I don't care how many times you've been told your voice doesn't matter, you're emotional, you're too much, you're crazy, all of these things. You're a prophet too. Like, your voice is so important now more than ever. And I hope at least one person takes this and starts living their truth more vocally. And we need your voices. We need more voices
Yeah.
out there. So that's my takeaway. Be like Mary, for sure.
Yeah.
Be like Mary.
I think for me, the final thing I'll add that came up when you were just saying that is her belief in God is her belief in herself, and her belief in herself is her belief in her God, and that the faith that she has in this spiritual truth is the faith in herself and her spiritual truth, right? And it speaks to what we've talked about before about the I am, the God you that exists within all of us, that it's you are your most divine thing. We all have access to God all the time because we are always with ourselves. And I think she is such a beautiful role model of that. So I completely agree.
Yay, Mary.
Listeners, yeah. Well,
Such
thank
a great
y'all
exploration.
Yes. No, I completely agree. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us today, for joining us for another episode of Bow Down and another segment of our Biblical Womanhood series. If there's another biblical woman you would like us to explore next, there's a few more that both Dennis and I are interested in diving into, but if there's a specific one you want to see next, definitely let us know in the comments, or, DM us on Instagram or wherever you're seeing this. We have all you can reach us in all the places. We would love to know, and we would love to know what you think. Did this make you think about Mary Magdalene differently? Or remind you of some of the pieces that are there, that have been there for you all along?
Love it. Well, thanks everyone for listening to us, and Reese, thank you for the exploration. This was beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. So
Absolutely.
Until next time.
Bow Down is a weekly podcast from the Cohere Collective that explores esoteric and empowered feminism.
Please subscribe to Bow Down wherever you may be listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a like, a 5-star rating, and a review. And if there's anyone you think would enjoy this episode, or maybe just needs to hear it, please share it.
If you want to stay up to date on all things Bow Down, you can follow the Cohere Collective on any social media platform at the Cohere Collective, and check out other content and offerings at www.thecoherecollective.com.
If you're interested in working with Reese to find and pursue your purpose, I encourage you to head to www.thecoherecollective.com/life-coaching.
If you're interested in working with Dennis to shed your mask and embrace your desires, you can email Dennis at dennis@theheartstoybox.com.
A huge thank you to Jack Corbett for Bow Down's music. You can find him on Instagram at j.corbe. Thank you all for joining us today. We're so glad you're here.
And as always, we hope you feel like you are living more coherently. And until next time, love.